uh, uh, a question that's a little more serious in terms of existential experiences. One major reason that many people don't believe is or doubt is because of stories of suffering or even personal loss. People maybe lost a loved one. A couple of years ago, you did a talk in New Zealand, I think in Christchurch, or just after that big earthquake in Christchurch, and you titled the talk, Why? I think in our country, we also experience some kind of suffering in the sense that we have some of the highest crime rates. People are victim to that many times. There's tremendous poverty and some senseless violence, like in a lot of other countries in the world as well. We've had the Oscar Pistorius thing, you probably know about that. And so it just seems so unnecessary, all these things. Why? What would you say?
I feel this problem, it's the hardest problem I face. And it's the hardest problem you face. And in a sense, it's the hardest problem atheists face. There are no simplistic answers to the problem, the twin problems of moral evil and pain. That is what we sometimes call natural evil. Brain tumors, tsunamis, earthquakes, and so on. So that's the first point to make. And the fact is this: we live in a world that presents a mixed picture. It's like Coventry Cathedral. There are traces of beauty, and there's evidence of bomb damage. And all of us have to cope with it. Now, because of my travels and interests, I've been in Auschwitz many times. And I've sat with many weeping Jewish people as they think about what happened to their relatives in Auschwitz. And I've always wept in Auschwitz. It's not a place where you can remain emotionally detached. So I feel the problem, and I face it all the time. I've just been in America in the Ivy League, and I think 3 out of the 6 universities wanted me to talk about this as being the major problem that students were coping with. And you know, let me illustrate it with a story, because you can philosophize about this for a long time, but I remember sitting a long way from here and a long way from home with a couple of Israeli engineers. They were very bright, and we were having breakfast together. And they discovered, because I told them, that I was about to give lectures on the book of Leviticus in the local museum. And they said, Leviticus? But you're not Jewish. I said, no, I'm not, but I'm going to try and persuade my Christian colleagues that it's worth taking this stuff seriously. So we started to talk. And eventually I saw them looking at each other, and they said, before we go any further, we need to tell you we don't believe in God. Oh, I said, I'd be very interested to know why. We're not going to tell you, I'm sorry. So we went on talking, and then they were glancing husband and wife at each other and came to a decision. He said, look, we are going to tell you, but don't blame us if it ruins your faith. And I said, and they meant it kindly, I said, if my faith can't face questions, it's not worth believing in, so go ahead. Okay, he said, we love reading. And Bashevis Singer won the Nobel Prize for Literature, an Israeli author, and he wrote a book called The Slave. And in it he describes how on one occasion in Russia, Jewish women and children were buried alive. And he said, as we read that, I don't know whether Singer said it or it was their reaction. When we read that, the light went out. There is no God. So he said, I'm very sorry, but that's where we stand. And I said to them this, I said, okay, there's no God then. You've solved the problem. That's how it is. And they looked at me very strangely. And they said, but you still believe in God? Yes, I do. I said, but I can understand why you say there's no God. So let's just look gently at what that solves. It solves your intellectual problem. The universe is just as it is, to quote Dawkins. No good, no evil. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. There's no ultimate meaning. But I said, I notice another thing. You haven't got rid of the suffering. It's still there. And in fact, you've got rid of another thing, hope. Because now you have absolutely no hope whatsoever. Because your atheist worldview means that death is the end. So there is no hope for these people. Secondly, you've got rid of the concept of justice, so that if they felt there was justice in the world, it has proved to be an illusion. So you've got rid of a lot. So they said to me, how do you face this question? I said, with great difficulty. But you're going to have to take a journey with me that you're going to find very difficult. Because I said, to cut to the core of this, we can argue what a good God should, would, might, possibly, and we can all think our way, we think, into the mind of God, what he should be able to do, could be able to do, and all the rest of it. When we've finished 1,000 years arguing like that, we still are faced with a ragged, raw, bleeding, suffering world, aren't we? And none of us is satisfied with those arguments. Have you noticed that? When we get dissatisfied with arguments, we need to use that as an indicator that maybe we're asking the wrong question. So I said, since I can't solve those questions, what God theoretically could, should, and I would like him to have done, although I can see at the level of moral evil, as Lewis points out, that if God could have, of course, created a world in which there was no sin by making you a robot, because robots cannot sin. They're not moral beings. But when I go home tomorrow, I shall be delighted my wife is not a robot. With an iPad now, and a little thing that comes up, text, kiss, press button B. Well, you're laughing because you realize that there's no personal relational dimension. In order to have a relationship possible, you must be able to say yes and no. The capacity to say yes and no is the biggest gift we've been given by God. It's what creates the potential for A, morality, and B, relationships. Lewis was right in that, I think. But coming down to the quick of the question, and it is a big question, and I'm doing it very rapidly, and I don't normally do it rapidly. I say, since we cannot in the end solve all the philosophical questions, I have another question to ask. Is there any evidence anywhere in the universe that God can be trusted with the ragged edges? Now I said to these Jewish friends, I said, I'm going to take you on a journey that's difficult. Because you've now realized that I believe that Yeshua is HaMashiach. I believe he's the Messiah. Yes, they said, we do. Now, you find this difficult, but just come with me and try and come in your mind. I also believe he's the Son of God. And you know he was crucified. Yes, they said. I said, what do you think God was doing on a cross in that sense? And I said, if that really is God there, God incarnate, do you know what it tells me? At the very least, it tells me that God has not remained distant from the problem of human suffering, but has himself become part of it. And at that moment, she burst into tears. And she said, why has nobody ever told me that about my Messiah before? I've had that experience several times. I do not think, ladies and gentlemen, there is any way of even having a window onto this problem without the cross. And it's that makes Christianity utterly unique. Jesus competes with nobody, because nobody offers us this. Now there's much more to it. And because that is God incarnate, he rose from the dead. And that means that death is not the end. And it tells me, as Paul told the Athenian philosophers, that Jesus is going to be the judge. This is a moral universe. And justice is real. And therefore, even though on the one hand I have major intellectual problems with many questions, I think there's enough evidence to believe that when we see, now I'm wording myself extremely carefully, when we see what God has done with the innocents that have perished, we'll have no more questions.